Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. We're in Ruth chapter 2 tonight, verses 1 to 16. Ruth chapter 2, verses 1 to 16. Now, we did three verses last week or four, right? So sometimes we do these little small chunks because there's a lot of theology to talk about in those small chunks, or there's an important sense of punctuation there in the narrative. It punches us in the face a little bit. And that's what we had kind of last week at the end of chapter 1. We had this exclamation point. Don't call me Naomi. Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, right? Call me bitter, not pleasant. And that was a punctuation point, maybe an exclamation point at the end of chapter 1. As we come into chapter 2, we have a story, a narrative story that's hard to break up. I mean, we could break it up and be more detailed in what we do. But I think the flow is important here from verses 1 to 16. And the flow is kind of Ruth's initiative. Ruth takes the initiative. Then we see a dialogue between Boaz and Ruth. And then we see kind of Boaz's hospitality to Ruth. Much more than just allowing a foreigner to glean in the fields. Right? So we have this Ruth's initiative, their relationship or their first conversations, and we see the health in that conversation. We see the health in Boaz's life. And then we see the hospitality he shows to Ruth. And that story just flows so well. I didn't want to break it up. So verses 1 to 16 of Ruth chapter 2. Let's read it and listen for that flow. Ruth, then Ruth and Boaz, and then Boaz. The word of the Lord. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseers of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with the people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, she said. You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar. When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. That is just so fascinating. I mean, there's a lot of fascinating dimensions to it. One of the fascinating things about the book of Ruth is that we get a lot of speech from women. You don't get a lot of speech from women in the rest of the Hebrew Bible. You do here and there, but Ruth, you get more, you hear more. Yeah.
Didn't you say Ruth was written during the time of the judges?
Yeah, it's during the time of the judges.
Judges didn't have respect for women.
That's a good point. The ending of Judges, chapter 17 to 21, we got a lot of violence against women. Remember the concubine that was handed over for sexual pleasure, and then they killed her and he cut her up and sent her, and then some women were forced into marriages. And I mean, the end of Judges, when everybody did what was right in their own eyes, right? There was a violent abuse of women. And I think that some people put Ruth next to Judges to say, whoa, wait a minute, that's not how you treat women. Boaz is how you treat women, right? What Boaz is doing is kind of the counter narrative of violence against women. In Judges, you have violence against women, but in the book of Ruth, you have this compassion, this grace, this hospitality for women. Not just for women, but for a Moabite. Not just a Moabite, but a widow. A barren widow. A widow without children. Who is a part of a household that doesn't have a man. Right? She doesn't belong to anybody. She doesn't have a husband. She doesn't have a father in the land. So she's one of the most vulnerable women imaginable in ancient culture. She has no resources. She has no security. She has no field. She has no food. She has no inheritance. She is vulnerable, which makes Boaz's actions exemplary. Right? But before there's an action by Boaz, though, Ruth takes the initiative. Now, just put yourself in that situation. You're a widow with no children who's living in a household with no man, living with your mother-in-law whose husband is dead and her 2 children are dead. You have no resources, no security, no protection. And Ruth says, I'm going to go find a field. Ruth takes this initiative. And she says, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. I don't know, some of your translations may say something like behind, maybe I will find his favor. Anybody have a translation that says his favor instead of anyone? It's what you can translate it that way. And some people thinking that, oh, I'm going to go target Boaz. That's what Ruth is doing. She's targeting Boaz. But I don't think that's right. I don't think she's targeting. She's going to go into a field. She's going to find a field where she can glean from the edges of the field. Which Boaz was at this point. Yeah, I don't think so. Well, I think probably Naomi knew who Boaz was, probably because of family connections. But there's no indication that Ruth is going to go find Boaz. She's just going to find a field where she can glean. Now, remember in Leviticus chapter 19, those who owned the land and did the harvesting were not to harvest everything. They were supposed to leave some along the edges, right? That was a requirement. You're supposed to leave some along the edges for the poor, for the needy, for the widows. And that's not a practice just only in Israel. That's a practice in other cultures as well. So probably Naomi's aware of that. Ruth's aware of that. And so instead of us starving here, Ruth is going to take the initiative and go find a field where she can glean along the edges. Right? Yeah.
Did the men do all the harvesting back then? I just wondered if Ruth wouldn't
Yeah.
field full of men. Weren't that added a little bit to it?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the risk here, right? That, as you're saying, typically, this wouldn't necessarily always be true, but typically, and what is apparently the case here, men were cutting the stalks, right? And when they cut the stalks, maybe they would bundle them, maybe not. But then the ones who would come behind, the gleaners. So you have the reapers and the gleaners, right? So the reapers are cutting the stalks. The gleaners are coming behind the reapers, the harvesters, and bundling them up, getting them ready, maybe even doing some initial shaping, where you throw it up, where you kind of wave it to get rid of all the chaff, kind of thing. Maybe doing some of that as well. But yeah, usually that's a male-female thing. The males were harvesting, reaping, and the women were gleaning. Yeah. Hard work. If you got a big field, you need something. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, right. Servant girls, maybe part of his household, maybe just hired workers, because a lot of the servants were just hired workers, kind of thing. People who work for them. So yeah, servant girls. So they're part of the gleaning. So you can imagine this situation where Ruth comes to this field and the gentlemen say, well, look what she says, go ahead. So she went out and entered a field and began to glean behind the harvesters. She doesn't stay on the edges. She's got the boldness to go into the field and go behind the harvesters. And she apparently asked permission to do that, because when the overseer replied to Boaz, she said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. So coming behind the harvesters was something she asked for, which again is her boldness. She's taking initiative. She is bold, confident, but she's putting herself at great risk. And the risk is she has no protector. She's a Moabite. And these are male harvesters who have the potential to abuse her, the potential to use her, the potential to do evil to her. I mean, if you're living in the time of the judges, right, when everybody did what was right in their own eyes, and you have these stories of violence to women in Judges 17 to 21, and now you have the story of Ruth living in that time period, takes the initiative and has the boldness to go into a field and work behind male harvesters. She doesn't know who these people are. She's at tremendous risk for abuse, especially being a Moabite. We get an indication of that because Boaz says, what does he tell his workers? What does he tell his workers not to do? Don't mess with her. Yeah. Don't bother her. Don't molest her. Don't reprimand her. In other words, Boaz is concerned that she's in danger and that she's at risk. Now, Boaz's female servants, female workers who are presumably employed and supported, know who these male harvesters are. There's some kind of relationship there. Don't have any idea about how detailed that is, but in other words, there's some comfort level probably between the female gleaners and the male harvesters. But Ruth is coming from the outside and entering a field where nobody knows her, and therefore open to abuse because she doesn't belong to anybody. Now that's what Boaz asked, right? When Boaz comes to that field, he's coming to visit his workers outside of Bethlehem in the field, and he sees Ruth. He doesn't know who Ruth is, right? And what does he ask? What does he ask his overseer? Yeah. Think about what that question implies. Yeah. It sort of implies like it's not good for a woman to be independent. She needs to belong to somebody for her own protection. Right? Who does she belong to? And basically the answer, no, she doesn't belong to anybody. It's a patriarchal question, right? Who does she belong to? But she doesn't belong to any man. She doesn't have a husband. She doesn't have a father, at least in the land. But nevertheless, that doesn't hinder Ruth. That doesn't stop Ruth from pursuing her goal to feed her family, right? So she takes on the role of the provider with Naomi. She takes on the role of the traditional role of the male because there is no man, right? So she's willing to take that risk and make that. Now, notice, what does your translation say? In verse 3, the NIV says, as it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz. Anybody else have a different translation for that? As it turned out, or as it happened, as it happened, as the case was. It's actually the Hebrew word for chance, Your translation says chance? Okay. But chance, it's the Hebrew word for chance. Now that's the narrator saying, by chance, Ruth ends up in the field of Boaz. And we might all say, wow, what a stroke of luck. But the narrator, you think the narrator thinks this is luck? No, I don't think so. I think the narrator is just speaking from the standpoint of the horizontal, right? As it happened, or as it turned out, or by chance. As we look at it, it's just circumstance. As we look at it, we might call it luck or chance. But the narrator, I think, has a much more robust understanding of that this is not by chance. This is what we might call, one of those divine moments. One of those moments where God is connecting people. And we could look at those moments and say, oh, it's providential. I mean, that's chancy, or that just happened. But I think the narrator sees this as God at work, the hidden work of God in connecting Ruth and Boaz. Right? She ends up, by chance, quote unquote, in the field of Boaz. Now, Boaz is described as a person of standing, verse 1. What different translation do we have for that? a man of standing. What else do you have? Wealth, what? Prominence, prominence. Wealth. Say it again. I didn't hear that. Worthy. Oh, okay. Thank you. Sorry about it. I forgot my hearing aids tonight, so you'll have to be patient with me. Or you don't have to be. You can go away mad if you want. But yeah, worthy. This is a hard word to translate because it has a wide range of meaning, from wealthy to status to worthy, prominent, leader. I mean, there's a wide range here. But what's important to remember is that this word is the word that Boaz uses to describe Ruth in chapter 3. So in the narrative of Ruth, this word is not primarily about wealth or even necessarily prominence. I think it's more about character. It's more about that sense of worth in terms of character and integrity, which in the story of the narrative, that character, that integrity is about hesed, about loving kindness, about loyalty. So when the narrator says Naomi, has a relative on her husband's side, a man of Hilil, I think that's the word, if I remember right. I think he's not just talking about, oh, he's a wealthy man, got money, owns some fields. That might be true, but I think in the narrative, that's not the point. The point is, this is a good man. So we're told right up front that he's worthy. And then he demonstrates it by how he relates to Ruth, right? So what we've been saying then, we summarize up to a point. Well, I got to get moving here. But Ruth takes the initiative. She risks going into the field. She risks going behind the harvesters, not just staying on the edges, but going into the field behind the harvesters. She risks being abused by the men in the field, because this is the time of the judges, right? So she's showing her own kind of character and her own kind of boldness. And Boaz's response to that is hospitality. Well, let's look at when Boaz shows up in verse 4. Boaz shows up, chapter 2. And he says, "The Lord be with you," or Yahweh be with you. That might just be a way of saying hello. Like the English word goodbye is really about God and blessing. It's a blessing, you're blessing somebody. But I think it's probably more than that. I think it's probably exhibits a relational sense of God's presence. The Lord be with you. That is, God is active, God is blessing, and we see that in the dialogue between Ruth and Boaz. When Boaz says to Ruth, "Oh man, the Lord's rewarding you. The Lord is involved in this. The Lord is doing something for your sake," right? So the Lord bless you, I think, is not just a greeting, but it's a greeting of blessing. And then the workers respond, right? And you, which is what we do in liturgy, right? We say, "Peace of Christ be with you," and also with you, right? So that kind of greeting is filled with theological weight. It has depth to it. It's not just kind of superficial, "How you doing?" Kind of thing. It has depth to it. And so he says, who is this woman over there that doesn't belong to anybody? Right? Well, she's Ruth. And apparently in that moment, the overseer tells the story. Now, how does the overseer know the story?
Somebody told him.
Somebody told him? Yeah. Maybe, Bethlehem's not that big a town. You might remember that. Bethlehem, it's not a town of 10,000 people or something like that. We're talking about a village. We don't know how many people, but it's on the smaller side. Ruth and Naomi come back, or Naomi comes back with Ruth. That's got to be, remember, they were excited to see her, right? I imagine that story's going around, right? And the workers in the field say, "Oh, you're Ruth. Yeah, we heard about you." Boaz comes into the field and says, "Who is that woman?" "Oh, that's Ruth." "Oh, heard about you." Yeah. I think that sort of thing is going on. But it's the narrator's way of saying, this is how we got to this point. Ruth working in the field, the Moabite working in the field for Naomi. So when Boaz begins to address Ruth, what strikes you in verse 8 as he begins to talk to Ruth? "Oh, my daughter." Interesting way of, what do you hear in that? What do you hear in "my daughter"?
Loving kindness.
Loving kindness. Okay. Relationship. Yeah. An age difference, maybe. Yeah, that could be there. That's possible. Even as we get to the end of the story, when Boaz marries Ruth, it's the age difference in marriage was usually pretty significant. Like in Ghana, they asked me to tell my story, and I said, "Well, I got married at 19." They all go, "Oh," they were all kind of shocked that you got married at 19. How do you do that? How do you get married at 19? And in conversation, I found out that the tradition is still there in Ghana, that when you marry a woman, you have to pay a dowry to the father. Pretty good sized dowry too, depending, but it varies. But so these guys have to work for 7, 8, 9 years to save up enough money for a dowry. Yeah. And so they have the age, ages can be very close together, but they can also be like 10, 15 years apart. And that might be true, something like that in Israel, the age difference. So yeah, it could be age difference as well. Yeah. But it's certainly affection. So he lets her know right off the bat, "I'm not your enemy. I'm not going to abuse you. I'm not going to let other people abuse you," which is exactly what he says. Don't go in another field. I don't know those people. I can't control what they do to you. You stay in my field because I'll protect you. I'll take care of you. And you go with the other women. In other words, it's not get out of my field. You poor people should only be on the edges. That's not his response, right? He says, "My daughter, stay in my field. Stick with my women."
So is he offering to be the male in the family?
Not at that point. I don't think he's taking that role. That would be the role of a husband. I think at this point he's just saying, "I'm going to protect you as you work in my field."
Safe place.
That's a good way of saying it. It's a safe place. This is going to be a safe place for you, Ruth. You don't have to worry about being bothered or abused. Which I think it's hard for us to overestimate the vulnerability of Ruth in Bethlehem. How vulnerable she is. Yeah, being a Moabite, right? Being a Moabite, being a widow, being barren. And all we have to do is remember the violence against women in Judges 17 to 21, where you have a concubine who has low social status, who is, basically owned by another, and mistreated and abused and killed, raped and killed, right? That could happen to Ruth. She's vulnerable to that kind of abuse. But what we have in Ruth is a counter narrative to the Judges narrative, to basically offer a different valuing. Whereas women are not valued in the end of Judges, in this narrative, women are valued and protected. Right?
Women are valued or Ruth is valued? That's the hard part of it. I ordered my servants not to attack you.
Mm-hmm.
But presumably the protection is not there for somebody else? Or?
Well, I think I would extrapolate from that. I think I would say the way he's treating Ruth is how he treats all his women workers. That would fit the character of Boaz. It wouldn't be a very good character to say, you harvesters can abuse these women, but not Ruth. That wouldn't. Seems to me, you be with my women, because my women are protected. My women are not going to be abused, and you're going to be with them. That's how I read it, at least. So let's and notice what he says to her in verse 9. Follow along after the women. I told them not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you're thirsty, go get something to drink. In other words, we get the food and drink hospitality in this story, because she ultimately is invited to the meal, right? To sit at the meal. And Ruth's response is gratitude, humility. Why have I found such grace, word grace or favor, in your eyes that you notice me a foreigner? She's self-conscious. She knows who she is. She knows her vulnerability. She knows her precarious situation. And yet at the beginning, that's what she was wanting. She was wanting to go find somebody. You go back to chapter 2, verse 2. What is she looking for? She's looking for that person who will show her grace. So she just happens to be in the field of Boaz, who is a worthy man. And Boaz shows her grace. And she recognizes this. The grace that she's been seeking, that she wanted to seek, is now she's receiving, and she's grateful for that. So in verses 11 and 12, Boaz says, I'll tell you why. I honor what you did for your mother-in-law. I honor your courage. I honor your loyalty. I honor your compassion for your mother-in-law. I honor your fact that you're here in this field, working, seeking help, seeking to provide for Naomi. And that you left your homeland to come here. And the blessing, if you look at that blessing in verse 12, may the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. That imagery of under the wings. What does that imagery tell you? Protection. Okay. You get that, maybe an image of a mother bird who's got her little kids in the nest, and then during the storm covers them with her wings to protect them from the storm. In fact, Psalm 57 verses 1 and 2 uses this language of I will find refuge under the shadow of your wings until the storm has passed. until the storm has passed. So you think about Ruth undergoing a storm, being present in a storm. What's happening to Ruth and Naomi in the storm. And Ruth has sought refuge under the wings of Yahweh, other than the wings of the Lord. Boaz is telling us, at least as the narrator wants us to hear it, seems to me, that Ruth has made a serious change. She has seriously taken up the worship of Yahweh, coming under the wings of Yahweh, seeking the protection of Yahweh, and that Naomi's God really has become her God. Right? And that Yahweh is responding. Yahweh is not absent from her life, but engaged in her life, present in her life, and blessing her, rewarding her. Let's not hear reward kind of in a transactional sense. Let's hear reward in a blessing kind of sense, that God blesses in a relational way, not necessarily a transactional way. Like, okay, Ruth, you did so much good. All right, I'm going to give you this much good. We'll make it a quid pro quo thing, right? I don't think that's how you could hear it that way. If you had a theological system that was based on that, you could easily hear it that way. But I think in a Hebraic world, that blessing is not so much a down payment or a repayment or something of that nature. It's not a commercial metaphor. It's more of a relational metaphor. The relationship of being in relation with the other. So that's how I hear it, at least. Yeah.
Still amazed with her when you talk about the genealogy of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Ruth is in there.
Yeah, Ruth is in the genealogy of
So he's
Jesus.
got somebody, I don't think we put it in there, it's Rahab.
Yeah. Well, there's Rahab and there's Bathsheba. And, yeah. Tamar. So yeah, I mean that's you're jumping ahead of me, brother. You know, you're getting way out there. You know, just saying. Before I know it, you'll be in 1 John. You know, yeah. No, you don't have to be quiet. I'm just pointing out you're getting ahead, and that's okay. We can. It's good to see the whole picture, you know, as we're talking about the details. So there's an interesting phrase here in verse 13. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, grace in your eyes, my Lord. In other words, I'd like to keep coming back to your field. You know, that sort of thing. You have put me at ease. It's a comforting sort of thought. By speaking kindly to your servant. Now, here's the interesting possibility. Speaking kindly to your servant, in some contexts, has kind of romantic connotations. In some not always, not even mostly, but in some contexts. And even to say romantic is to be a little anachronistic, because marriage is not based on romance in the biblical world. I'm sure there were some occasions for that, like Song of Solomon has some of that, right? So we wouldn't want to exclude that totally, but typically it wasn't. So is there romance in her language here, or is there just, oh, you know, you're treating me so well, thank you. Yeah. You like what? Gratitude. I think it's more just gratitude, but I wouldn't totally rule out the romantic either, especially when we see what she does in the next chapter. And we'll get to that next time. So in that last section, we're about to run out of time here, verses 14 to 16. I mean, the way Boaz is bending over backwards, you might say. Come have some bread. Sit down with the harvesters.
Maybe he
With
has
the men.
eyes for her.
Huh?
Maybe he has the eyes for her.
Maybe so. Maybe, you know, it's what they tell us in grade school, right? That when a young boy kind of hits a girl, he likes her. You know, that kind of thing, right? And maybe Boaz has a liking for her. At the same time, it's Ruth that's going to take the initiative, not Boaz, for the potential marriage. Boaz doesn't do this and then show up at her place and say, "Hey, let's have a date." You know, Ruth shows up at his place, right? So maybe there's a likability there. There's a valuing there, but we haven't made that move yet. Right now, it's just Boaz pouring blessing upon Ruth, this Moabite, this widow, this barren woman. And Boaz is not holding back on the blessings. Come eat with us. Eat with the harvesters, which may be eat with the men. Come over here. I'm eating with the guys. Come over here and eat with us. Maybe. Gave her some roasted grain. She was satisfied. She got up to glean. Tells the guys, don't bother her. In fact, do some of the work for her. Right? Do some of the work for her. Leave them for her to pick up bundles. Make the bundles and do the gleaning as well as the harvesting, and leave them for her. And we'll see in verse 18 that she carries back, or verse 17, she carries back more than you can imagine, more than what she needed. But don't rebuke her, don't reprimand her. In other words, protect her. Don't mess with her. Why is he motivated to that? Romantic? Maybe. Who knows? We don't know. But maybe it's just family. Naomi and Boaz are from the same clan. They're relatives. And when he finally knows who she is, and she's in his field, he is pouring grace on her. Maybe as part of the clan. You know, and grateful for what she did for Naomi. Grateful for her courage, grateful for her boldness to take care of Naomi. Now it raises the question, why isn't anybody else taking care of Naomi? You know, why wasn't Boaz at Naomi's house saying, what do you need? We don't know. I mean, that's not the story, right? That's not the narrator's topic. The narrator's topic is to highlight Ruth, who is doing something courageous, risky, and exemplary. And Boaz's response to her is not to abuse her, molest her, do violence to her, but an exact opposite of what happened to the women in Judges 17 to 21, to show grace and blessing and to honor her. Come eat with me. That's hospitality. And I think that's really, really important to grab hold of that. That the story in Ruth is not just about the minutia of Ruth and Boaz. I think the canonical function of telling the story of Ruth, the way the telling of the story has meaning in contrast to the story of Judges. To say, not everybody in Judah was like them. There were people who loved Yahweh. There were, like in Elijah's time, there were 6,000 who hadn't bowed down the knee, to Baal. There were people who knew the chesed of the Lord, who knew the loving kindness of the Lord, who knew the grace of the Yahweh, and they showed it, even to a Moabite. I think that's part of the point. It's a larger narrative than just the story of Ruth and Boaz. Not First John, right? Okay. Huh? Go ahead.
The story's about Ruth, but Boaz, it comes up to these people out in the field out there and said, the Lord be with you.
Yeah, right.
Can't tell what kind of man he is.
Right. He's a worthy man. He has a character. He greets people with a blessing from the Lord. I think that's very apropos. I think that's who Boaz is. And we'll see Boaz take responsibility and respond to what Ruth does. And so we have two great characters, Ruth. Now we started out with Naomi. Naomi's going to be the beginning and end of the story. Boaz and Ruth are in the middle of the story. And they are both described by that same word. And it's only used twice in Ruth. It's used once of Boaz, and it's used once of Ruth. These are worthy people. They are people of character. They are people who are serving Yahweh. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with us all. Amen. Yeah.
That's it.